Is ready? What do you think of when I say the word IQ test? Do you think of intellectuals? Do you think of intellectual disability? Not a lot of people really understand what IQ tests are, or how they started and how they got to where they are today. In order to give you a little bit better understanding, I'll give you a little bit of history in IQ tests and how they got to where they are today. You see, IQ tests began in the late 1800s as a part of the American eugenics movement. However, I'll expand a little bit more on that later. They didn't really do much until about the 1940s, where they started being used as a standard for military enlistment. If you didn't have a high enough IQ, you couldn't be enlisted. This generated a lot of controversy. However, eventually the controversy subsided and testing went on. Throughout the years, we've revised and improved these tests in order to make them better, until about the 1990s or so, and since then they've remained stagnant. Recently, with new discoveries of the human brain and human psychology, IQ tests have come under fire for not being accurate enough to measure human intelligence or intellectual disability. I agree. IQ tests are not a sufficient measure of intellectual disability at all, and here are my reasons why. First, IQ tests can be affected by different situations and the scores can become inaccurate. Secondly, IQ tests can be highly interpretable and end up doing more harm than good. And third, IQ tests were founded on unideal principles and are defective by nature. So, to move into my first point, different circumstances can introduce variation. According to Lee Gunderson, the department head and a doctor in literature and language education, and Linda Seagal, a doctor in special education, in an article that they co-wrote in 2001 in The Reading Teacher, a teaching academic journal, English as a second language students could end up having their scores inaccurately reflecting their intelligence. They believe that the English as a second language students simply don't have the second language complex understanding or the second cultural complex understanding that they need in order to score well on these tests. This can lead to these ESL students, as they're called. This can lead to them being diagnosed as mentally disabled when really they aren't. This can of course create headaches and a lot of problems that wouldn't have been created with a better test otherwise. According to Colmar, Maxwell, and Miller, the former two being notable psychologists and the latter being a grammar instructor at the University of Sydney in Australia, the tests themselves were designed for non-disabled people. This means that people who are intellectually disabled aren't actually having these tests even being written or devised for them. Now, this doesn't affect the majority of the population. However, it does affect those who are intellectually disabled and need an accurate diagnosis of where they truly need intellectual help. To move into my second point, the tests can be highly interpretable and end up doing more harm than good. I was reading a chapter in a psychology studies book called Psychology in America, written by multiple notable psychologists. They state that these summary scores aren't actually that accurate to the individual, and they can leave a false impression. Now, of course, the individual scores do pretty well, but most people look at the summary scores, and the government including also looks at these summary scores. A quote in the book says, "Certainly these IQ tests alone are not sufficient prognosis for mentally disabled people, especially children," which leads me into the next part of this point. Once again, according to Gunderson and Seagal, IQ tests leave borderline students often without the help that they need. In fact, only about 36% of students with learning disabilities have a low enough IQ to get the proper aid and care that they need in order to grow to their fullest potential. This applies to government aid as well. Only a certain percentage receives the aid that they need because only that certain percentage has a low enough IQ to actually qualify. Granted, this doesn't happen in all scenarios, but it does happen in enough to create a problem. This leads me into my third and final point. IQ tests are defective by nature and were founded on unideal principles. Alex McClymans, a senior researcher in the Center for Health and Social Care Research, gives a little bit of history on the IQ test. He states that the IQ test was founded by Sir Francis Galton, the founder of the American eugenics movement. Now, you don't really need to know anything about the American eugenics movement, except that it essentially was an effort to breed out stupidity from the population. Galton used this IQ test to make a standard, and if you got anything below that standard, you were essentially to be not allowed to breed or have children anymore at all. This obviously creates problems, and yet we're still using this test today that we founded on his principles. I don't think that that's right. Alfred Bidet, another creator of a different IQ test, even warned that you shouldn't use his IQ test measurements to measure intelligence. Now, to me, that says that there's something wrong with the IQ test when both the founder and modern notable psychologists are saying that these IQ tests aren't exactly that accurate and only should be used as a general idea to measure intellectual disability. According once again to Colmar, Maxwell, and Miller, there's also considerable variation between these IQ tests, even with standard error deviation being taken into consideration. This means that while somebody might score high enough on one test to not be considered mentally disabled, they might score low enough on a different test to be considered mentally disabled. This can once again create problems with government aid and assessing where they might actually need help in education and growing to their fullest potential. So, to conclude, my 3 points were that IQ tests were essentially written for English speakers and non-disabled people. This means that certain situations can influence the IQ test, which isn't any good. Secondly, that IQ tests are interpretable. People can use the scores to interpret the tests in different ways, which can lead to a lot of variation in how you see the scores. Next, the IQ test can serve to hinder students that don't have a low enough IQ score to match their learning disability. This obviously creates plenty of problems that I don't think need to be said. And finally, the IQ tests were founded on ineffective and unideal philosophies that I don't think anybody nowadays would agree with. I think that if we want a true IQ test, we need to rewrite the IQ test from scratch and found it on new philosophies and new ideals from modern day times that match our modern day psychology. Thank you.